Imagine you drop your phone. It just, slips right out of your hand, falls to the floor, and the screen shatters.
Oh, the worst feeling.
Right. It's frustrating, sure, but it is completely... If you ask a physicist why the phone fell, they will give you this elegant equation detailing the gravitational attraction between the mass of the phone and the mass of the Earth.
Exactly. It's just standard mechanics.
But, and this is the crazy part, what if you ask that exact same physicist to absolutely 100% logically prove that the next time you drop your phone, it won't just, float up to the ceiling?
Well, the really uncomfortable truth embedded in our source material today is that they actually can't do it.
Which just sounds insane.
It does. I mean, they can point to centuries of historical data, right? And they can point to the consistency of all their mathematical models. But a pure, unassailable, logical proof that gravity will work tomorrow exactly the way it did today, that simply does not exist.
Which is deeply unsettling to me, because we all walk around with this absolute faith that science is this indestructible fortress of objective truth.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you think of a spreadsheet at your desk right now. You trust those projections, you trust the software running the numbers, and you basically base your life decisions on the idea that the laws of physics and mathematics are fixed.
Yeah, we take it completely for granted.
But when you actually peel back the layers of how we know what we claim to know, you find yourself staring into this massive philosophical void.
And that void is exactly the territory we are exploring today. So we're pulling from this really extensive academic text on the history and philosophy of science. Mm-hmm. And the mission for this deep dive isn't just to, catalog scientific discoveries.
Right. We're not just listing facts.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It is to map the invisible, constantly evolving architecture underneath all those discoveries. We're really looking at humanity's shifting definition of truth itself.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the roadmap we have for today is just wild.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. We are going to start by traveling way back to the ancient world, looking at how Aristotle viewed a universe that was driven entirely by purpose.
A very different way of seeing things.
Yeah, and then we'll watch that entire worldview get basically demolished by the mechanical breakthroughs of Galileo and Newton.
The whole clockwork universe idea.
Exactly. Then we are jumping into the 20th century, where the philosophical gloves just completely come off.
Oh, it gets vicious.
We'll dive into the fierce clashes between the logical positivists who wanted absolute strict verification and Karl Popper, who argued that science is actually all about trying to destroy your own theories.
Which is such a counterintuitive idea.
Totally.
Yeah.
And from there, we'll explore Thomas Kuhn's revolutionary concept of paradigm shifts. And finally, we'll arrive at today's modern pluralistic view of how science actually operates in the real messy world.
Yeah, and to really grasp the scale of that transition from ancient myths all the way to modern pluralism, we have to realize that this is fundamentally a story about human cognition. We have to begin with that very first initial break from mythological thinking. Because in the ancient world, causality was entirely tethered to divine whim.
Like the gods were just pulling the strings.
Exactly. If a storm destroyed a crop, it was a localized expression of Zeus's temper. If a plague struck, well, Apollo was offended. The universe was reactive, it was emotional, and it was inherently unpredictable.
So humanity's first major intellectual leap was really just having the audacity to assume that maybe the universe isn't a soap opera starring a bunch of temperamental gods.
That is precisely what the text highlights with early Greek thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. They introduced this radical presupposition that the cosmos actually possesses an inherent rational order.
An order that just runs on its own.
Right, an order that operates completely independently of any divine intervention. Thales, for instance, famously hypothesized that everything in the universe was fundamentally made of water.
Which, obviously, factually, we know is totally incorrect today.
Oh, completely incorrect. Yeah. But philosophically, it was a monumental breakthrough.
Because he was trying to find a single rule for everything.
Yes. He was attempting to explain the immense chaotic complexity of nature using a single underlying observable principle. That was the exact moment nature was first framed as something the human mind could systematically investigate.
And eventually comprehend. It's basically the birth of natural philosophy.
It really is.
But the source material quickly pivots from those early guys to Plato and Aristotle, where things get significantly more structured. And I really want to linger on Aristotle for a moment, because his version of science dominated human thought for centuries.
Millennia, almost.
Yeah. And it's just so alien to how we think today because we are taught that science is all about measuring things, right? But Aristotle's science was entirely about understanding the why.
That's the key difference. Aristotle instituted a framework known as the four causes. And to possess true scientific knowledge of any object, in his view, you had to define all four of these causes.
And what are they?
They are the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. So let us apply this framework to the smartphone you mentioned earlier.
Hi, sure. Let's do it.
The material cause is simply what it is made of. So glass, silicon, lithium, the physical stuff.
Makes sense.
Then the formal cause is its design or blueprint. It's the specific structural arrangement that makes it a phone rather than just a shiny paperweight.
Right. The shape and the code.
Exactly. Then you have the efficient cause. That's the actual manufacturing process, the robotic arms in the factory, assembling all the pieces together.
Okay, so far that tracks perfectly with modern engineering. That all makes total logical sense. But then we hit that fourth one, the final cause.
Yes, the teleology.
Right, the teleology.
The final cause is the telos. That means the ultimate purpose or the goal for which the object exists in the first place. So for a smartphone, the final cause is human communication.
Which, applying purpose to a human-made artifact, makes intuitive sense. Of course a phone has a purpose. We built it for one.
Exactly. But Aristotle's massive leap, and this is what defined the entire ancient worldview, was applying those final causes to natural phenomena.
Right, things that humans didn't build.
He argued that everything in nature acts with an inherent goal.
And this is the part I really want to drill into because it's so hard to wrap a modern mind around. Like, we think of a rock falling as just dead matter submitting to an invisible force called gravity.
Just blind physics.
Yeah, blind physics. But Aristotle looked at that exact same falling rock and saw an object that was actively trying to fulfill its destiny.
That is exactly how he framed it. He classified the physical universe into distinct elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And he believed each element possessed a natural resting place in the cosmos.
So they wanted to go home, basically.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
A rock, being primarily composed of the element earth, falls downward not because it is being pulled by an external gravitational force, but because it possesses an internal drive. It literally wants to reach the center of the cosmos.
That is so what?
And conversely, fire rises because its inherent purpose is to reach the celestial sphere up above. Teleology dictated that the universe was not just a collection of blind interacting forces.
It was a deeply purposeful hierarchy.
Right, a hierarchy where every single object yearned to actualize its potential.
So the Aristotelian universe actually cared about what was happening. It was a cosmos filled with inherent meaning and distinct goals. And that framework holds incredibly strong, especially when it gets fused with medieval theology later on, all the way until the 16th and 17th centuries.
A very long run.
Seriously. But then the scientific revolution hits. And it's not just an upgrade to the math, right? It's an absolute philosophical demolition of teleology.
The paradigm shifts completely. You have Copernicus displacing the Earth from the center of the universe.
Which is a huge problem for Aristotle.
A massive problem. Because if the Earth isn't the center, it immediately shatters the Aristotelian idea that heavy objects naturally seek the cosmic center. Then you have Kepler, who utilizes vast amounts of observational data to formulate the elliptical orbits of planets.
Mapping the heavens with strict geometric precision.
Exactly. But the ultimate catalyst for the modern mechanical worldview, the one who really drives a stake through teleology, is Galileo.
Galileo is the one who basically brings a stopwatch to a philosophy debate.
I love that framing.
Because Aristotle had reasoned that heavier objects must fall faster than lighter objects because they possess more of the earth element, right? More earth means more desire to go down.
That was the logical deduction, yes.
But Galileo says, let's stop theorizing about its elemental desires and just measure the drop.
And by doing that, Galileo systematically separates the qualitative aspects of nature from the quantitative. He famously argued that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics.
Just numbers and shapes.
Right. Concepts like purpose, essence, color, and taste, what later philosophers would eventually call secondary qualities, were entirely stripped away from scientific inquiry. Galileo focused exclusively on primary qualities: shape, size, motion, and number.
And this momentum just compounds from there. You have Francis Bacon defining knowledge entirely around empirical control, the whole idea that understanding nature is really just about dominating it, predicting it, making it work for humanity.
Knowledge is power.
Exactly. And then you have René Descartes arguing that animals, and indeed the entire physical universe, are merely complex automata, machines. And it all reaches this grand crescendo with Isaac Newton.
Newton is the synthesis of it all. His Principia combined the terrestrial physics of Galileo, how things move on Earth, with the celestial mechanics of Kepler, how planets move in space, into a single unified framework.
One set of rules for everything.
Yes. His laws of motion and universal gravitation demonstrated that the exact same mathematical forces governing a falling apple also govern the orbits of moons and planets.
Which is a beautiful, elegant synthesis. I mean, it's brilliant, but, and this is big but, it comes with a massive existential cost.
A profound cost.
So, to use an analogy, it's kind of like looking at a car engine. The Aristotelians were standing around the engine asking, what is the ultimate destiny of this engine? What is its deeper purpose within the cosmos?
Right, searching for meaning.
Yeah. While the modern scientists, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, they just rolled up their sleeves and said, we don't care about its destiny. We just want to measure the pistons, calculate the horsepower, and predict exactly how the fuel ignites.
And taking that analogy further, the moderns ultimately concluded that the engine has no destiny at all.
Right. It just runs.
The universe, under the Newtonian paradigm, is an infinite, indifferent clockwork machine. It operates according to completely deterministic mathematical laws, utterly devoid of any final causes or inherent meaning.
Which really knocks humanity off its pedestal.
Fundamentally decentralized. We were relocated from the purposeful center of a caring creation to just a minor planetary outpost governed by blind mechanical forces.
But here is where the source material takes a massive left turn. Because once we stripped out the why and decided we were only going to rely on measuring the mechanics, relying purely on observation and mathematics, a terrifying problem emerged.
The problem of certainty.
Yes. We bet the entire house of modern science on our ability to observe things and induce universal laws. And then David Hume comes along and basically points out that the foundation of the house is built on sand.
Hume is brilliant, but yes, deeply disruptive. This crisis of certainty really begins with the broader epistemological debate over the source of human knowledge.
Where do ideas even come from?
Exactly. You had the rationalists, such as Descartes, who believed that foundational knowledge could be derived from innate, self-evident rational principles inside the mind. But then you had the empiricists, primarily John Locke, who countered that the mind at birth is a blank slate.
A tabula rasa.
Right. And they argued that absolutely all knowledge must originate from sensory experience. David Hume took that empiricism and pushed it to its absolute devastating logical conclusion.
Let's really spend some time on Hume's critique of induction, because I honestly think it's one of the most intellectually disturbing concepts in the history of philosophy.
It really pulls the rug out from under you.
It does, because induction is simply taking specific observations like, I drop a pen, it falls. I drop an apple, it falls, and creating a universal law. Gravity causes things to fall. Science needs induction to survive, right?
It's the core engine of scientific law.
But Hume says, wait, you are hallucinating the causation?
He challenged the very concept of a necessary connection. Hume said, if you observe a billiard ball striking another billiard ball, what do you actually see? You perceive the first ball move, you hear the sharp sound of the impact, and then you perceive the second ball move.
Right.
You experience a sequence of distinct sensory impressions. Event A occurs, followed by event B. However, Hume pointed out that you never, ever actually perceive the invisible force of causality transferring from one ball to the other.
Wait, but if I'm holding the pool cue, I feel the resistance, I see the physical impact, my brain is screaming that I caused that ball to move. How can Hume just say causality isn't there?
Well, Hume would argue that your feeling of resistance is just another separate, isolated sensory impression. Your brain is assembling all these contiguous events and forming a psychological habit.
A habit.
Yes, because you have witnessed event A, followed by event B, countless times in your life, your mind just automatically anticipates event B upon seeing event A. But, and this is crucial, psychological anticipation is not a logical proof.
Oh, wow.
There is no logical contradiction, Hume argues, in imagining that the next time you strike that billiard ball, it turns into a bouquet of flowers, or it just simply vanishes into thin air.
Which brings us right back to the phone-dropping thought experiment from the intro. We have observed gravity working perfectly for the entire history of human existence. But logically, Hume is saying that an infinite number of past observations does not guarantee a single future outcome.
Precisely. The classic example in the text is the sun. The statement, the sun has always risen, does not logically necessitate the statement, the sun will rise tomorrow.
It's just highly probable based on habit.
Exactly. The problem of induction struck at the very core of the scientific revolution, because scientists were formulating these grand universal laws of nature, claiming absolute objective truth based entirely on their empirical observations.
And Hume just wrecked that.
He revealed that empirical science could never yield absolute certainty. It could only yield highly probable habits of thought. If causality is merely a psychological illusion born of repetition, then the grand mechanical universe of Newton is not a proven reality. It's just a very persistent assumption.
I genuinely try to put myself in the shoes of a scientist reading Hume for the first time back then. It must have felt like the floor dissolving beneath their feet.
Pure existential dread for a physicist.
Right. If Hume just proved that causality is basically an illusion, doesn't that mean every physics equation is just an educated guess? How did scientists and philosophers not just throw their hands up and abandon the whole enterprise?
They desperately needed a philosophical rescue, and that rescue arrived in the form of Immanuel Kant.
The heavyweight?
Indeed. Kant explicitly stated that reading Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. He recognized that if Hume's strict empiricism was entirely correct, the universal necessary truths of mathematics and natural science were utterly impossible.
So he had to fix it.
He had to figure out how synthetic a priori knowledge could exist, meaning knowledge that tells us something new about the physical world, but is universally and necessarily true prior to us even experiencing it.
And his solution is what he called a Copernican revolution in philosophy, right? He completely flipped the relationship between the observer and the observed.
It's exactly. Previously, philosophy always assumed that human knowledge must conform to the external objects. The mind was seen as a passive receptor like a mirror, trying to accurately reflect a pre-existing reality.
Just taking in what's already out there.
Right. Kant reversed this completely. He argued that the objects of our experience must conform to the structure of our cognition.
I'm stuck here, because if my brain is actively formatting reality, how do we explain the mechanics of that? Are you saying you and I are just sharing the exact same hallucination?
Let us examine the mechanics of Kantian cognition because it's fascinating. Kant proposed that our human minds possess a priori structures. Think of them as built-in filters that exist prior to any sensory experience whatsoever.
Okay, built-in filters.
Space and time, for Kant, are not physical containers existing out in the universe. They are the fundamental a priori forms of human intuition.
Wait, space and time are in us, not out there.
Precisely. Your mind essentially functions as a spatial and temporal rendering engine. When raw, chaotic, unknowable sensory data enters your mind, your cognitive architecture immediately automatically organizes it into spatial dimensions and temporal sequences.
Okay, so space and time are literally like the operating system of the human brain. Like you can't process an app without the OS running first.
That is an excellent modern equivalent. The OS runs everything. Furthermore, Kant argued the mind utilizes 12 a priori categories of understanding to make sense of all the spatial temporal data.
And causality is one of them.
Yes, one of those categories is causality. We do not discover causality out in the world, as Hume accurately noted. Instead, our minds impose the concept of cause and effect onto the sensory data in order to construct a coherent, understandable experience.
Okay, this is brilliant, but it is also genuinely terrifying. Kant basically saves science from Hume by saying, don't worry, causality is real because it's hardwired into our human brains. But the massive trade-off there is that we can never, ever see the universe as it actually is.
That is the trade-off. Kant formalized this division. The world as it appears to us, successfully structured by our cognitive filters, is what he called the phenomenal world.
The world of phenomena.
Yes. This is the realm where science operates.
Yeah.
And within this phenomenal realm, causality and Newtonian laws are absolutely true and objective for all human beings, because we all share the exact same cognitive operating system.
Right. We all run the same software.
But the world outside of our perception, the noumenal world, what he called the thing in itself, is forever fundamentally inaccessible to us.
It's like we are all wearing permanent cognitive virtual reality headsets.
That's a great way to visualize it.
We can perfectly map out the physics of the VR simulation. We can completely agree on all the rules of the game, but we can never actually take the headset off to see the physical server running the code.
And that Kantian compromise, while it secured the foundations of Newtonian physics for the time, planted a seed of profound doubt regarding our access to ultimate reality.
I can see why.
As we moved into the 19th and early 20th centuries, this deep anxiety over what we can actually claim to know just intensified. Philosophers and scientists became completely obsessed with stripping away any metaphysical baggage.
No more talk of unseen server.
Exactly. Any talk of unseen essences or noumenal worlds was rejected. They wanted to anchor science strictly and only to what could be physically measured and verified.
Which sets the stage perfectly for Auguste Comte's positivism in the 19th century.
It does.
He argued that humanity essentially goes through these historical stages of maturity. We start in the theological stage, right? Blaming lightning on angry gods. Then we mature a bit into the metaphysical stage, blaming lightning on abstract, unseen forces or essences.
Right, the hidden causes.
And finally, we reach the ultimate adult phase of the positive stage. In this positive stage, we stop asking these unanswerable questions about ultimate reality, and we just focus entirely on describing observable phenomena and their mathematical relations.
And Comte's positivism laid the crucial groundwork for one of the most aggressive and influential philosophical movements of the entire 20th century, logical positivism.
The Vienna Circle.
Yes, spearheaded by the Vienna Circle. This was a brilliant collective of mathematicians, logicians, and philosophers. Figures like Moritz Schlick, Rudolf Carnap, and Otto Neurath.
Some heavy hitters.
They looked at the landscape of philosophy at the time, which was dominated by really dense, abstract idealism, and they sought to radically sanitize human language.
And I love looking at how they actually tried to pull this off. They didn't just write essays complaining about bad philosophy. They literally tried to weaponize logic.
Weaponized logic is a good term for it.
They developed this thing called the verification principle. And it essentially stated that if a sentence isn't a tautology like a basic math equation, or if it cannot be strictly empirically verified through direct sensory observation, it is literal nonsense.
Not just false,
No.
nonsense,
No.
meaningless. The mechanism they utilized to do this was called logical atomism. They believed that incredibly complex scientific theories could be logically decomposed step by step down into fundamental protocol sentences.
Protocol sentences, what does that look like in practice?
A protocol sentence is a direct, immediate report of a raw sensory experience. For example, at 10:00 a.m. in this specific laboratory, the dial on this specific instrument points to the number 5.
Okay, so think about the spreadsheet you were looking at this morning at work. You trust those numbers, you trust those projections. But under the Vienna Circle's strict rules, if a cell on that spreadsheet contains a projection about market behavior next quarter,
Yes.
and you cannot map that projection directly back to an observable physical protocol sentence happening right now, that projection is technically meaningless metaphysics.
Under their strict criteria, yes, it would be. They intended to create a flawless, completely unassailable empirical language.
Yeah.
Any concept that could not be reduced to observable data was out.
Everything abstract just gets thrown in the trash.
Exactly. Concepts like Hegel's absolute spirit or the Freudian unconscious, or even ethical statements like stealing is wrong, all of these were dismissed as pseudo-problems. They were seen as mere expressions of human emotion rather than statements of objective fact.
It's an incredibly aggressive way to clean house, but the source material details how this verification principle almost immediately collapsed under its own weight.
It was a spectacular collapse.
Because it turns out building a fortress out of pure sensory data is functionally impossible.
The flaws of verification became glaringly apparent very quickly, exposing 3 insurmountable walls. First, the problem of universal laws.
Which brings us back to induction.
Exactly. Science relies on absolute statements like all copper conducts electricity. However, as we discussed with Hume, you cannot empirically observe all the copper in the entire universe, past, present, and future.
You literally don't have the time or the protocol sentences for that.
Right. Therefore, universal scientific laws cannot be definitively verified. Yeah. So, under the strict rules of logical positivism, the foundational laws of physics are technically meaningless.
Which completely defeats the entire purpose of the movement. I mean, they wanted to save science from metaphysics, and they ended up accidentally outlawing science.
A slight miscalculation.
Yeah, just a bit. And the second wall is even more embarrassing for them.
The second wall is self-referential failure.
Oh, this is the best part.
The verification principle itself states that a proposition is only meaningful if it can be empirically verified. Yet the verification principle itself is neither a mathematical tautology nor an empirically observable fact.
You can't put the concept of verification under a microscope.
You cannot.
Oh.
Therefore, by its own internal logic, The verification principle is a meaningless metaphysical statement.
A complete philosophical cell phone. Just brilliant. And then you hit the third wall, unobservables. Because if you restrict language entirely to what the naked human eye can see, how do you do modern science?
You really can't.
The advancement of 20th century science heavily relied on theoretical entities that were inherently unobservable at the time. Electrons, gravitational fields, quarks, black holes.
None of which produce protocol sentences.
No. If a theory utilizing the concept of an electron yields highly accurate, mathematically consistent predictions, a strict logical positivist struggles to validate the theory because the electron itself cannot be reduced to a direct sensory protocol sentence.
So the Vienna Circle is just sitting there watching their flawless language project shatter into a million pieces. And right at this critical moment of crisis, Karl Popper steps into the arena.
A giant of 20th century philosophy.
Yeah. Popper looks at the positivists desperately trying to definitively prove theories true through all this observation, and he realizes they have the fundamental logic of science completely backward.
Popper identified that the positivists were trapped by a logical fallacy known as affirming the consequent. You simply cannot logically prove a universal theory true by accumulating confirming evidence.
It's the induction trap again, yes. And this brings us to the famous asymmetry of logic that Popper leveraged. Falsifiability. While no amount of observation can logically prove a universal statement true, a single contradictory observation can logically prove it false.
The black swan.
The famous black swan.
You can log 10,000 white swans in your notebook, and it still doesn't logically prove the statement all swans are white. But the exact second you observe a single black swan, the universal theory is instantly logically destroyed.
Popper argued that science does not operate through inductive verification. It operates through deductive falsification, utilizing the logical form of modus tollens.
So the goal isn't to be right.
No. The hallmark of a truly scientific theory is not how much confirming evidence it has managed to gather, but how aggressively it exposes itself to being proven wrong. A valid scientific theory must make bold, risky predictions.
Let's ground this in a modern high-level example, because I think about the hunt for the Higgs boson particle.
A perfect example.
Right. The standard model of physics predicted the existence of this particle. Physicists didn't just sit around looking for general phenomena that sort of generally fit their theory. They built the Large Hadron Collider, this massive multi-billion-dollar machine in Europe, specifically to test this risky prediction.
Putting it all on the line.
Exactly. If they smashed those protons together at the exact right energy levels and the Higgs boson did not appear, the entire standard model of physics would have been in profound crisis.
And that is precisely what Popper demanded. He termed this the demarcation problem. How do we distinguish rigorous science from pseudoscience?
And he had some specific targets in mind, didn't he?
He did. Popper surveyed popular theories of his era, specifically Freudian psychoanalysis and certain Marxist theories of history, and he noted a disturbing characteristic. These theories possessed immense explanatory power. They seem to be able to explain literally any human behavior or historical event.
Right. If a patient acts aggressively, psychoanalysis explains it as repressed trauma. But if they act completely passively, well, it's just a reaction formation to that exact same trauma.
Heads I win, tails you lose.
Yeah. No matter what the patient does, the theory has a built-in psychological mechanism to absorb the data.
And Popper argued that a theory that explains everything actually explains nothing. If a theory can be endlessly molded, reinterpreted, or expanded to absorb contradictory evidence, it is immune to falsification.
It can't be touched.
And if it can't be touched, it is structurally indistinguishable from religious dogma. For Popper, the scientific method is a continuous, relentless process of conjectures and refutations.
Guess and test.
Scientists propose bold, imaginative hypotheses, and then they ruthlessly attempt to tear them down with rigorous empirical tests.
Wait, so you're telling me a theory is only good if the person who created it actively tries to destroy it? That goes against everything human psychology tells us about confirmation bias and human ego?
It is incredibly demanding, yes.
It essentially frames science as a massive game of King of the Hill. A theory only sits at the top of the mountain, not because it is the absolute immortal truth, but simply because the scientific community hasn't managed to knock it off the hill with a black swan yet.
It demands an almost superhuman level of intellectual humility. Popper's idealized scientist is primarily a critic, not a builder.
Right.
But your skepticism regarding human psychology there leads us directly to the next monumental shift in our source text.
Because it sounds a little too perfect.
It is. The question becomes, Does the actual historical practice of science resemble Popper's idealized game of relentless falsification?
Right. Because if we look at human history, when a scientist spots a black swan, when a massive experiment contradicts their entire life's work, do they immediately publish a paper saying, I was wrong, my theory is garbage, let's start over?
Rarely.
Absolutely not. They check to see if the telescope lens was smudged, they recalculate the mat, they assume the equipment failed or the grad student messed up.
This historical reality was meticulously documented by Thomas Kuhn, who was actually a physicist turned historian of science. In 1962, Kuhn published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which fundamentally shattered the neat, linear rationalist models proposed by both the positivists and Popper.
A total earthquake in philosophy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Kuhn argued that if you analyze the actual historical record, science does not progress through a steady accumulation of facts, nor does it progress through a series of continuous, ruthless falsifications.
Kuhn introduces a word here that has since been totally hijacked by every corporate seminar on earth: the paradigm.
Oh, yes. Paradigm shift.
We need a paradigm shift in our marketing strategy, but we really need to explore what he actually meant by it, because it is much deeper than just a new way of thinking.
Much deeper. For Kuhn, a paradigm is an all-encompassing conceptual framework that is shared by an entire scientific community. It is not merely a single dominant theory like Newton's laws.
It's the whole package.
It includes the accepted theoretical assumptions, the standardized methodologies, the specific instruments considered valid, and crucially, the agreed-upon set of problems that are deemed worthy of investigation in the first place. A paradigm basically defines the very reality the scientist perceives.
So when scientists are working within a paradigm, they aren't trying to break the system like Popper wanted. Kuhn called this normal science, right?
Correct. Normal science.
And normal science is basically just puzzle solving. The paradigm provides the box, it provides the picture on the cover of the box, and the scientist's job is just to fit the puzzle pieces neatly inside it.
During normal science, falsifiability is essentially suspended. If an experiment yields a result that contradicts the paradigm, what Kuhn termed an anomaly, the paradigm itself is not falsified.
The paradigm is safe.
As you suggested earlier, the anomaly is blamed on instrumental error, human incompetence, or it is simply shelved as a minor puzzle to be solved later. Scientists protect the paradigm at almost all costs, because without it, they literally have no framework for conducting research.
But eventually, those puzzle pieces that don't quite fit start piling up in the corner of the room. You get an accumulation of anomalies.
They become impossible to ignore.
A great high-level example of this is the crisis at the end of the 19th century that led to quantum mechanics. Newtonian physics was the reigning paradigm, right? It worked beautifully for planets and falling apples.
It was the undisputed king.
But when scientists started looking at the atomic level, things like black body radiation, the photoelectric effect, the Newtonian puzzle pieces simply stopped fitting. The math was breaking down.
And when anomalies accumulate to a critical mass like that, resisting all attempts at resolution within the existing framework, the scientific community enters a state of crisis.
Panic mode.
Confidence in the paradigm fractures. And it is really only during this period of crisis that scientists behave somewhat like Popper suggested, proposing bold, radical, and highly speculative new theories. When a new conceptual framework emerges that can successfully resolve those crisis-inducing anomalies, a scientific revolution occurs, a paradigm shift.
And here is where Kuhn gets incredibly controversial, because the logical assumption is that the new paradigm, say quantum mechanics, is objectively better, more rational, and closer to the ultimate truth than the old Newtonian paradigm.
That's the hope.
But Kuhn argued that you can't actually prove that using a neutral metric.
This is the concept of incommensurability. Kuhn argued that successive paradigms are fundamentally incompatible. They speak different languages, they ask entirely different questions, they utilize different standards of evidence, and they employ different vocabularies.
Like comparing apples and oranges, but for reality.
The term mass, for instance, means something entirely different in Newtonian physics than it does in Einsteinian relativity. Because there is no neutral, objective language that sits above both paradigms, you cannot simply place them on a scale and logically deduce which is superior.
Hold on. If we can't objectively compare paradigms, you're saying Einstein isn't actually more right than Newton. That sounds like absolute relativism.
It terrified a lot of philosophers.
Yeah, I bet. Because if a scientific revolution is just a change in perspective without any objective guarantee of progress, then science starts to look less like a steady climb up the mountain of truth and more like we're just wandering around changing outfits. I'm not sure I buy that.
You are definitely not alone in that reaction. Many philosophers shared your exact alarm. If Kuhn was right, the transition between paradigms resembled a sudden religious conversion or a psychological gestalt switch rather than a rational logical deduction.
So how do we save science from relativism?
This threat prompted Imre Lakatos to attempt a grand synthesis. Lakatos sought to rescue the rational rigor of Popper while simultaneously accommodating the messy historical reality described by Kuhn.
Lakatos maps out science using a concept he called research programs, and this is where we need to elevate the metaphors. The outline suggested a fortress, but I honestly think a modern software analogy works so much better to explain the mechanics of what Lakatos is proposing here.
Ooh, I like that. Let us construct that software analogy. Lakatos argued that a research program consists of two primary structural components, a hard core and a protective belt.
So the hard core is basically the foundational source code of the operating system. In Newtonian mechanics, the hard core is the universal law of gravitation and the three basic laws of motion.
Right.
And this core code is locked. You cannot alter it. You cannot question it. And if you try to delete it, the entire system crashes.
To prevent the system from crashing when inevitable anomalies occur, scientists construct the protective belt. This belt consists of auxiliary hypotheses, initial conditions, and specific observational models.
Okay, so returning to the software analogy, the protective belt is the series of software patches, updates, and DLCs that developers constantly download to fix bugs in the simulation, all without having to rewrite the foundational engine.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. And the source material provides the perfect historical example of this patching mechanism in action, the discovery of Neptune.
Oh, I love this story.
In the 19th century, astronomers observed that the planet Uranus was wobbling. Its orbit did not perfectly align with the predictions generated by Newton's hardcore equations. It was a massive anomaly.
So, according to strict Popperian falsification, the anomalous orbit of Uranus should have instantly falsified Newtonian mechanics. Newton should have been thrown out.
Exactly. But the scientific community did not delete the hardcore. Instead, they utilized what Lakatos called a negative heuristic, a methodological rule strictly forbidding them from directing falsification at the core itself.
They protected the king.
They directed their focus entirely at the protective belt. They proposed an auxiliary hypothesis. Our initial conditions are simply incomplete. There must be an unseen eighth planet out there exerting a gravitational pull on Uranus.
They wrote a software patch. They said, hey, let's just add a planet to the map. They pointed their telescopes based on the math of that specific patch, and boom, they found Neptune. The patch worked perfectly.
And because of that, Lakatos argued that a research program is evaluated not by momentary, isolated falsifications, but by its long-term historical trajectory.
Is it moving forward or backward?
Right. Is it a progressive research program? Does tweaking the protective belt lead to the discovery of stunning new facts, like the existence of Neptune? Or is it a degenerating research program where scientists are constantly issuing ad hoc software patches just to cover up theoretical bugs without ever actually predicting anything novel?
Lakatos is brilliant because he gives us a rational mechanism for how scientists stubbornly defend their theories while still allowing for actual progress.
It's a very practical middle ground.
But if paradigms are completely incommensurable, like Kuhn said,
Right.
and research programs are constantly adjusting their protective belts to avoid falsification, like Lakatos said, is there an actual definitive scientific method?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because this brings us to the most radical thinker in the entire source text, who looks at this whole debate and basically advocates for intellectual arson.
You were referring, of course, to Paul Feyerabend and his philosophy of epistemological anarchism.
What a title.
It is provocative. Feyerabend surveyed the extensive history of scientific development and arrived at a highly controversial conclusion. There is no single universal scientific method. There is no rigid set of methodological rules that all scientists must follow or have historically followed to achieve success.
His famous phrase is, anything goes, which out of context sounds like he's saying science is arbitrary nonsense and we should just let astrologers run the astrophysics department.
Right, which is how a lot of people misinterpreted it.
But that's a total misreading of his actual argument, isn't it?
Completely. Anything goes was not an endorsement of chaos. It was a historical observation. Feyerabend meticulously analyzed pivotal moments of scientific revolution, particularly Galileo's defense of Copernican heliocentrism.
The big shift.
And he demonstrated that if Galileo had strictly adhered to the rigorous methodological rules proposed by the empiricists, the positivists, or even Popper, he would have been forced to abandon his theory.
Because Galileo didn't actually have the hard proof at the time.
He did not.
When Galileo pointed his telescope at Jupiter to show the moons, the telescopes of the early 17th century were incredibly rudimentary. The lenses were flawed, the images were blurry and distorted.
Very unreliable instruments.
His critics, who were adhering to the accepted Aristotelian methods of the time, were actually being scientifically rigorous when they said, we can't trust these blurry optical illusions.
Feyerabend argued that Galileo did not win the day purely through unassailable empirical logic. Galileo utilized rhetorical persuasion. He used thought experiments. He wrote propaganda in colloquial Italian rather than academic Latin to reach the public. And he showed a blatant disregard for the established epistemic rules of his era.
He was a hustler.
In a way, yes. Feyerabend's thesis is that imposing a monolithic scientific method actually restricts creativity. True scientific progress often requires scientists to behave opportunistically, utilizing intuition, aesthetic judgments, and whatever conceptual tools are necessary to overcome entrenched dogmas.
But this brings us roaring back to that terrifying anxiety we felt at the very beginning of the deep dive.
The void.
Yes. If there is no universal method, and if Galileo was essentially using marketing tactics to sell his theory, how do we prevent science from just collapsing into subjective opinion?
A very valid concern.
Especially when Feyerabend, Kuhn, and another philosopher named Norwood Russell Hanson all agreed on an incredibly disturbing concept, theory-laden observation.
The doctrine of theory-laden observation completely dismantles the positivist dream of a purely objective, neutral protocol sentence. It asserts that observation is never a passive reception of raw data. It is actively constructed by the theoretical background of the observer.
Let's explain the mechanics of this using the X-ray example from the text because it makes it so clear.
Okay.
You have an ordinary person and an expert radiologist looking at the exact same X-ray of a human chest. Optically, physically, the photons hitting their retinas are identical. The raw visual data is exactly the same. But the ordinary person sees a chaotic, blurry collage of gray and white shadows. The radiologist looks at the exact same film and instantly sees a subtle, life-threatening pulmonary embolism.
And the crucial point here is that the radiologist does not see the shadows and then consciously, step-by-step, deduce the diagnosis.
It's immediate.
Yes. The theoretical training of the radiologist fundamentally alters their actual perceptual experience. They literally see the embolism. The observation is loaded, it is deeply saturated with the underlying medical theory.
Their brain's operating system has been updated.
Exactly. If observation is fundamentally shaped by theory, then the idea of an independent, objective, empirical foundation against which we test our theories is highly problematic because the theory is basically judging itself.
If observations are biased by theory and there's no strict rule book for the method, how is science any better than just guessing? This anxiety fuels the massive ongoing debate highlighted in the text between scientific realism and anti-realism, or instrumentalism.
This is the ultimate epistemological showdown. Scientific realists maintain that despite the historical shifts in paradigms, our most mature, successful scientific theories provide a true, or at least approximately true, description of reality.
That we're actually getting closer to the truth.
Yes. They argue that unobservable theoretical entities like electrons, DNA structures, or the curvature of space-time actually exist in the physical universe completely independently of our minds.
And the instrumentalists say, hold on, don't get arrogant. These theories are just incredibly sophisticated tools.
Just instruments, hence the name.
Right. A hammer is useful for driving a nail, but a hammer doesn't claim to be a perfect, true representation of the objective universe. Instrumentalists argue that theoretical models are just mathematical fictions that allow us to organize data and predict outcomes.
The source material details the primary weapons utilized by both camps. The anti-realists employ a historical argument known as the pessimistic meta-induction. It is a sobering reflection on the graveyard of past paradigms.
If we look at the 18th century, the absolute greatest scientific minds completely believed in the phlogiston theory of combustion.
Phlogiston.
The idea that objects contain this invisible fire-like element that was released when they burned. They built highly successful models around it. Or consider the 19th century belief in the luminiferous ether, an invisible medium carrying light waves through the vacuum of space.
Essential to their physics at the time.
At the time, those scientists were absolutely 100% certain those unobservable things were real.
And so the anti-realist argues inductively. Since the vast majority of highly successful scientific theories in the past have eventually been proven fundamentally false, regarding the unobservable entities they posited, we must logically assume that our current highly successful theories will also be discarded by future generations.
It makes sense.
To assume that we right now have finally hit upon the ultimate, permanent truth is historically arrogant.
It is a devastatingly logical argument based purely on history, but the realists fire back with an argument that I find just incredibly compelling. The no miracles argument.
Formulated largely by Hilary Putnam, yes.
Right.
The no miracles argument asserts that scientific realism is the only philosophy that does not render the success of modern science an inexplicable miracle.
Think about the Mars rover, or think about laser eye surgery, or the GPS satellites constantly calculating general relativity equations just to keep your phone's map accurate.
Everyday miracles.
If the quantum mechanics and relativity equations driving those technologies are just useful fictions, if they don't actually correspond to the hidden structural reality of the universe, then the fact that these incredibly complex technologies work flawlessly every single day is literally magic.
A cosmic coincidence.
It's a miracle. The math shouldn't be able to put a robot on Mars if the math is just a made-up tool.
The predictive power of modern science is so astonishingly precise that it demands an explanation. And the most rational explanation is that our theories are actually latching on to real, mind-independent structures of reality.
It's hard to argue with a robot on Mars.
However, Firebend provides a crucial sociopolitical warning here. Precisely because science produces these technological miracles, it accumulates immense cultural power. Firebend warned against allowing science to become a new, unquestionable ideology.
Like a new religion.
He argued for a separation of science and state, cautioning society not to treat scientific experts as infallible high priests.
Okay, deep breath. We are caught in this massive philosophical crossfire. We have the technological miracles of science pulling us toward absolute realism. But we have the pessimism of history, the theory-laden bias of our own brains, and the messy chaos of paradigm shifts dragging us back toward doubt.
It is a tense balancing act.
If humans are fundamentally biased and paradigms constantly shift, what is the modern synthesized understanding of how science maintains its objectivity?
The source material provides a really sophisticated resolution to this anxiety. Modern philosophy of science recognizes that the quest for perfect individual objectivity is a Cartesian illusion.
It doesn't exist.
Because of Kantian cognition and theory-laden observation, an individual scientist simply cannot detach themselves from their biases or their paradigm. Objectivity is not an individual psychological trait.
So if the individual is hopelessly biased, how does the system actually work?
Objectivity is redefined as a rigorous social process.
A social process.
It is the emergent property of a critical community. Drawing heavily on Popper's emphasis on criticism, modern philosophers like Helen Longino emphasize that objectivity is achieved through institutionalized scrutiny.
Like peer review.
Exactly. Double-blind peer review, methodological transparency, the strict demand for reproducibility, and a diverse scientific community capable of identifying biases that an individual researcher might overlook.
So the scientist's job is to build a theory and basically throw it into the Thunderdome.
The Thunderdome of peer review.
And the community's job is to act as the predators, relentlessly trying to tear the theory apart, looking for logical flaws, statistical errors, and black swans. The objectivity isn't in the mind of the scientist. It's in the brutal adversarial process of the community.
That is exactly right. Furthermore, modern philosophy recognizes that science is not a single monolithic entity. The methodological rules required for one discipline are fundamentally inadequate for another. The text delves into the epistemology of explanation models to really illustrate this pluralism.
Right, because calculating the trajectory of an asteroid requires a completely different cognitive framework than understanding why a human civilization collapsed.
Exactly. In the physical sciences, philosophers like Karl Popper developed the deductive nomological model. In this framework, you explain a specific event by demonstrating that it is the strict logical consequence of a universal covering law.
Like the pipe burst because water expands when freezing, and this specific pipe was filled with water below 0 degrees.
Precisely. It is a strict logical deduction.
But if you try to apply that strict mechanical deduction to biology, it just falls apart. You can't explain the existence of a heart using just physics and covering laws.
You cannot. You have to use functional explanations. The heart exists because its evolutionary function is to circulate blood, to sustain the organism.
Oh.
Biology introduces a kind of neo-teleology back into science understanding organs based on their purpose within a living system.
Aristotle sneaks back in.
He does, just a little bit.
Yeah.
And the methodological divergence becomes even more profound when we enter the social sciences. The text highlights a foundational debate between Emile Durkheim and Max Weber regarding the very nature of sociological inquiry.
Durkheim wanted to be the Newton of sociology, right?
He did. He took a heavily positivist approach. He argued that we should study social facts, things like suicide rates or economic trends, as if they were physical objects. You measure them, you quantify them, and you look for mathematical correlations, basically ignoring the messy internal emotions of the individuals.
Just looking at the spreadsheet. But Weber, conversely, argued that human beings are not asteroids or atoms. They possess inner lives, intentions, and cultural values.
Yes, Weber introduced the concept of Verstehen, or interpretive understanding.
How does that work?
If you observe a person cutting down a tree, a positivist can measure the kinetic energy of the axe swings. But to truly generate sociological knowledge, you must understand the meaning the actor attaches to the action. Are they clearing land for survival, acting out of anger, or participating in a religious ritual?
Social science cannot merely measure behavior. It has to interpret human meaning.
It must. This modern synthesis is so compelling because it embraces pluralism. We have different sciences using different models, speaking different languages, all trying to illuminate different facets of reality.
And modern philosophy is incredibly transparent about the fact that we are relying on models. Whether it's an epidemiological model simulating a global pandemic or a rational actor model in economics, we know these models are not perfect, one-to-one replicas of reality.
They are purposeful idealizations. They intentionally strip away the infinite complexity of the real world just to isolate specific causal mechanisms.
To make it understandable.
Right. Additionally, the contemporary philosophy of science explicitly acknowledges the role of social and ethical values in the scientific enterprise. Decisions regarding what research receives funding, how clinical trials define acceptable risk, and how uncertainty is communicated to the public, these are not purely objective mathematical calculations.
They are deeply entangled with societal values.
Completely entangled.
So bringing this massive journey to a close, what does this all actually mean for how we should view the concept of truth? Because it sounds like we all grew up believing science was this giant, expanding encyclopedia.
Right, a book of facts.
Every generation, brilliant scientists uncover a new objective fact. They write it down in ink, the book gets a little thicker, and we slowly march toward total omniscience.
That encyclopedia model is really just a remnant of 19th century positivism. The grand conclusion synthesized from the source text is that science is not a static warehouse of absolute, perfectly verified truth. It is a complex, historically situated, and relentlessly critical practice.
Listening to this, it feels much more like a living, breathing ecosystem.
The ecosystem is a wonderful analogy.
It adapts to the conceptual environment. It sheds dead skin in the form of old, degenerating paradigms. It evolves over time, constantly patching its theoretical software. And most importantly, it is kept healthy by predators, by a community of skeptical minds actively trying to falsify assumptions and locate the anomalies.
Science isn't reliable because it is perfectly unchanging. It is reliable specifically because it is structurally designed to correct its own errors.
It is the most powerful epistemic engine humanity has ever constructed, precisely because it has institutionalized the capacity for self-correction.
Absolutely. But the philosophical journey we have traced today leaves us with a profound realization, and this is a final thought I want you to reflect upon. Every single piece of scientific data you encounter, a medical diagnosis, a climate projection, an economic forecast, rests upon a hidden philosophical architecture that fundamentally dictates what counts as reality.
So as you go through your week, look closely at the unquestioned facts in your own profession, the data you rely on every single day. Ask yourself, are these absolute immortal truths, or are they simply the dominant paradigm of your current worldview, functioning perfectly well for now, but patiently waiting for a single unexpected black swan to arrive and rewrite all the rules?
Recognizing that distinction is the very essence of critical thinking.
That is the perfect, unsettling question to end on, because the exact moment we stop questioning the paradigm, we stop doing science entirely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the invisible architecture of knowledge. Keep analyzing those spreadsheets, keep looking for those black swans, and most importantly, keep questioning the world around you. We'll catch you next time.